I know that some in our audience know the finer points of hockey.
The Chris Johnston Show.
We are your friends.
The biggest stories, bringing you inside the game.
What did you hear?
The Chris Johnston Show. Powered by Sports Interaction. Wanna bet? What is going on?
Here's Chris with your host, Julian McKenzie.
Part of the game.
Big Money Siege. I missed you, buddy. Did you miss me? I know you're enjoying your summer vacation and all that. You good? How are you feeling? I know we got a lot of hockey to talk about, but like this is my first time being on video call with you in about a month. How are you doing? You doing good, buddy? Everything good?
Yeah, I'm great. I did miss you. I miss this. I miss producer Nick. I miss the rhythm. I mean, it's so funny, right? Like you want to have breaks, right? It's natural.
Mm-hmm.
You need to go on a vacation, even if it's a staycation, whatever it is. You need a break from the grind sometimes. But then like you do that, you relax with it, and it's like, man, but I also like the rhythm of my life. All this stuff's going on. We haven't talked about it all yet. Haven't broken everything down. So quite honestly, I was glad you guys were up for this special summer drop-in because I did miss it. And, it's just good to get together. Like, it's crazy. Think about it. We talk twice a week. Like, I talk to you more than I talk to, like, most of my best friends. I mean, in terms of frequency, just the way that the nature of our work is. So, not to say you're not one of my close friends, my man, but I just mean, like, we are talking more than most people in my family, basically, at this point in time. And then a month goes by, and we've only had a few texts here and there.
That's true, man. Like, I love when our group chat is like going off on like the most like random stuff. It's like I still, even though we're not doing the show, like I'm still connected to you and producer Nick and obviously the rest of the SDPN and stuff. So getting to it, but it's nothing like doing a show. It's nothing like being on camera. Like literally these last few weeks, I've just been lazing around my apartment. That was after obviously I went back home in Montreal and all that. But like I've just been lazing around my apartment, just looking for something to do. So I'm very happy. I'm very happy we're doing this.
Yes, guy. I love it. Let's get into it.
Okay. Let's talk about the biggest thing that happened over the last few days. The Erik Karlsson trade from San Jose to Pittsburgh. Montreal also getting involved as well. How did this all come together? Why did this take so long? Like, why are we, like, what's your analysis of this trade that has now brought Erik Karlsson, the reigning Norris Trophy winner, to the Pittsburgh Penguins under the watchful eye of Kyle Dubas?
Well, why did it take so long? Look at the trade, man. Like, if you don't have notes in front of you, could you say all the pieces? I mean, it's like 12 pieces in this trade and
Nope.
3 teams. And we've just now
I don't have any notes in front of me.
The largest contract. Right, there you go. And we've just now seen the largest contract in the NHL salary cap era be traded. I mean, we hadn't seen a deal $10 million or more get moved in this time. And so that's why it took so long. And I have to say, for me, this is one of the more interesting trades I think we've seen in years in a lot of ways. Like, I think that it's probably best almost to like focus in on each team, like what they were trying to accomplish and what they did or didn't in our estimation, because it's actually so complex in a sense about what everybody was doing and why it worked. And so I think it's almost a miracle it came together. You look back, we've been talking, I know, on our show, like in, February, January, could the Sharks move Karlsson? Kyle Dubas even mentioned when he met the media this week in Pittsburgh that his conversations go back to his previous employer, meaning when he was with the Leafs, he was having discussions with the Sharks about Karlsson. And we know the Leafs were one of the teams that were at least in there in the preliminary, late June, early July section of this. And then, ultimately Pittsburgh hammered away. I mean, it took every bit of this time when hockey goes through free agency, we get through the draft, free agency, a couple of signings, you get some arbitration hearings, but hockey starts to go quiet. Nothing went quiet behind the scenes with the Sharks and Penguins. And then ultimately they had to make a decision over the weekend because Pittsburgh did have a buyout window, which they maybe could have had to use depending on how this came together. It turned out they didn't. And my goodness, I mean, you're adding a 3-time Norris Trophy winner, a guy coming off a 100-point season as the defenseman, to a team that's just somehow trying to compete for a cup again. I mean, I think the storylines are juicy, and I think it's a really interesting trade from every aspect we might look at it from.
I love the fact that Kyle Dubas has wasted no time in establishing a core 4 in Pittsburgh as a result of this trade.
Well, why not? I mean, it's a different core 4. I mean, I saw Producer Drew was out there trolling on the internet there, if you saw his tweet. But, in all seriousness, you look at what the Leafs core for under Kyle Dubas is paid. This core four is paid markedly differently. I mean, Erik Karlsson's the top earner against the cap at $10 million as a charge to the Penguins. I mean, the Leafs have 3 players that make more than that, right? So it's not quite the same thing. Obviously, we're talking about players at an advanced age. I don't think anyone knows how this is going to work exactly, and I think that to me is part of what has my intrigue here. But this is the other thing Pittsburgh had. Before they made this deal, Julian, Pittsburgh had cap problems, right? They traded for Riley Smith. They signed a bunch of guys on or about July 1st, and they were in a difficult spot. They had 3 goaltenders, 3 NHL goaltenders. And in one fell swoop, they get rid of their 2 or 3 of their most problematic contracts. I would say Michael Granlund didn't live up to his $5 million cap hit in the time he was with the Penguins. It was a short run, but still, that was not a good move for Pittsburgh. It wasn't looking good. At this stage of his career, Jeff Petry wasn't worth the $6.25 million he was commanding on the cap. They get rid of a goalie in Casey DeSmith. They actually improved their cap position and added Erik Karlsson, which I think is a difficult thing to accomplish. And they also only ended up giving up 1 first-round pick. Now, it could be a good first-round pick. That's maybe some of what time will tell, because if Pittsburgh misses the playoffs next year, that could be the 11th overall selection, and it's a decent end first-round pick. But all things considered, I don't know how this is going to work out for Pittsburgh, but I do know they actually made their cap picture cleaner and got Erik Karlsson in the trade, which I would say would be almost impossible. I mean, any of the other teams that were looking at trading for Erik Karlsson, I think the reason it didn't get far enough beyond maybe initial talks with the Sharks is no one could do it without totally screwing up their cap board. Somehow Pittsburgh managed to clean up its cap picture and add Karlsson, and I think that's where Kyle Dubas does deserve some praise. I mean, ultimately, who knows? They could still miss the playoffs next year. I'm not saying this makes them a cup contender, but it's a bold play, and it was also one that makes a lot of sense in terms of the bigger picture. And I think that's quite a win. I don't know how they managed to pull that off, honestly, just given the amount of money Karlsson's owed.
This has to work, right? Because they've offloaded that first-round pick, and I get they have Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin and Chris Letang with Erik Karlsson, but we all know that core is aging. It was Sidney Crosby's birthday on Monday. He just turned 36. I know people are wondering, oh, well, if this season doesn't work out well, they could start that rebuild. This kind of has to work, right? Or am I seeing this wrong?
No, it has to work. And look, the most significant thing to me is not just Sidney Crosby's birthday. He's got 2 years left on his deal, right? And so I think at minimum, Pittsburgh is going to try to be as competitive as possible for those 2 years, at minimum. Now, Letang and Malkin are signed beyond that window, and I think ideally they'd like to have 3 or 4 more years. But who knows how these things are going to age. But I think, if you're Kyle Dubas, you have to have a real intense focus. I know that he's also thinking about how does he transition away from this group eventually. That's sort of the second part of his job. But I think the first one really has to be trying to give Pittsburgh the best chance to win this season, because that's all you really got for sure when you have players of this age. Obviously, we hope that they stay healthy, but injuries come into it at this stage. Decline in performance comes into it. Just all these things are a little bit unpredictable. And so, you added Erik Karlsson, and you didn't give up anything you wanted to keep anyway, other than the first-round pick, I'd say. I mean, that's pretty darn good business. Now, can Karlsson repeat his season? How do the minutes get spread with Letang? I mean, I would presume, and obviously no one yet is sort of commenting or saying this officially, but I would presume Karlsson kind of moves into the number 1 defenseman spot with Pittsburgh, and maybe it's Letang's role that gets reduced slightly or altered. Those will all be coaching decisions at some point in time. But it's like, how do you make this work is now probably the most pressing question for Pittsburgh. But you're right, it has to work. It has to give them a chance to they have to be playing playoff games, I think, at minimum. I mean, if they lose in the first round, no one's going to say, hey, this was a success. But no one in Pittsburgh liked the fact that this was the first time the core of that team had missed the playoffs ever together. And so I think that's the first hurdle for them. Kyle Dubas, if you look at his time in Toronto, he was always an active in-season GM too. I don't think it stops here, between now and next trade deadline. I think Pittsburgh will probably be looking to add and tinker and do what they can to best position themselves. But it's not going to get bigger than this. I mean, you see a Norris Trophy winner get traded like twice in a generation. Like, it never happens, right? And I know there's a lot of unique factors here, and the fact that Karlsson had tailed off and then had this amazing season last year, I think sets the ground for this kind of trade. But yeah, from Pittsburgh's end, this has to work because they all know there is a tomorrow not too far in the future that, you're basically tearing things down, or these players are maybe retiring. I mean, who knows? At some point, we might be talking about, do you trade, does Sidney Crosby play a season somewhere else? I mean, I think it's too premature to even speculate on that, beyond acknowledging, though, that these guys want to still win a Stanley Cup again if they can. And ideally, they want to try to do it together, and that's what next season's about. But, beyond that fact that things are going to change in Pittsburgh. But, for a GM that's hired at the end of May, start of June, I mean, this is a pretty big set of moves, even when you look at free agency and the other trades Dubas has made. I mean, he's put an immediate stamp on this team. It's got the same pieces in the core of it, but he's, we can reasonably say this is his team. And when you look at that forward group, there's a lot of new faces there, and we'll have to see if it works. I mean, that's why I think the Penguins, they're going to be must watch again. I mean, they've kind of been sliding towards yesterday's news a little bit. I think that they're going to be one of the most compelling teams entering the season, just seeing how this experiment works.
Totally agree. Can we spend a bit of time on Kent Hughes and the Canadiens for a second? They were involved in this trade.
Sure.
They get Jeff Petry back, and there seems to be some reports going around. I know Eric Engels from Sportsnet was first on this, that the Canadiens might move him. There may be some other rumblings that maybe Casey DeSmith might not be long for another place beyond Montreal. What's your assessment about Montreal's end of that trade and the pieces that they got?
Well, it's twofold, right? They got rid of Mike Hoffman's contract in this trade. It goes to San Jose as part of the three-way trade, and they didn't have to retain any salary there. They got Jeff Petry with Pittsburgh retaining 25% of his salary, rather. And they get Casey DeSmith, who's, at times been a very, very serviceable, average to slightly above average goaltender. And so I think if you're the Canadiens, you view the older players that they're taking on as assets, right? I think that's kind of the way Kent Hughes has managed, since taking the job in Montreal. His older players, by and large, he's traded the likes of Tyler Toffoli going back a couple of years, Joel Edmondson earlier in the summer. I mean, he's moved out guys like that. And so I think that certainly they'll look to do that, but I don't know that they absolutely have to do it. I mean, certainly there's going to be a glut in goal if they don't move DeSmith or Jake Allen or someone else. I mean, there's only so many roster spots, and waivers would come into play if they didn't make a trade prior to the start of the season. But I think that they have the ability to be a bit patient. And then, clearly in my eyes, Petry is probably the best pure asset in the deal that they're getting, just simply because if they now retain 50% of his contract in a deal, I mean, he's only slightly more than a $2 million defenseman. And I think at that price, even at his age, I think a lot of teams will look at that as a positive thing. A team to keep an eye on is Dallas. I know that their team over the last couple of years have had interest in Jeff Petry. I mean, the Stars, like a lot of teams in the league, don't have endless cap space. And I think there's been a multitude of reasons maybe that they haven't been able to act on a trade prior to now. But all of a sudden, the conditions are in place where, maybe the trade doesn't happen by the training camp. Maybe it doesn't happen by the start of the regular season. But certainly in these next few months, I think the Canadiens can really look at what's out there for Petry and if it makes sense for them to move him or not. I think they're going to want to do right by the player too. Remember, this is someone that they have a long history with on a personal level, played a lot of great seasons in Montreal. The Canadiens last summer honored his trade request and moved him to Pittsburgh. But I think there's a lot of familiarity and comfort there, and they're going to want to do the best for the team and for him personally. And so I don't know that we can say today he's going to be moved in the next 2 weeks. I don't know that that's necessarily the case, but certainly it's a possibility that I think a likelihood he's traded at some point. And so for the Canadiens, they're just taking on assets and they're adding picks still, right? I mean, they're using cap space. They're weaponizing their cap space to get more draft picks. And I think where they're at in their development, that makes sense. And, they were the key to this deal in the end. I mean, there was multiple third-party teams that were talking to Pittsburgh and San Jose, trying to make the puzzle pieces fit. And Montreal was the one where everything fell perfectly into place. And I do like the trade from their end of things, quite honestly. I mean, they just stepped in here. They added some assets. They got rid of a contract in Hoffman's that I think that they've been looking to move for some time. I know they lost Rem Pitlick as well, going to Pittsburgh as part of the trade. But, they add a draft pick. They add these guys I think will turn into draft picks and even a young player from Pittsburgh in the deal. And so it's hard not to like that piece of business from Kent Hughes' perspective.
So how would you rate Mike Greer's job in all of this? He offloads Erik Karlsson. He gets a first-round pick. It doesn't have to retain a lot of salary when it comes to Erik Karlsson's contract.
Which is probably something his owner likes, right? I mean, when we're playing armchair GM on our podcast, or when you're doing that with your buddies, talking about how these things work, I think you're going to look at the Karlsson return. You're going to go, wow, that's light, right? Like they didn't get anything that's that exciting if you're a member, if you're a Sharks fan right now. But you have to remember, his owner did not want to retain a lot of salary. His owner didn't have a high degree of comfort paying Erik Karlsson, say, $3 or $4 million a year to play somewhere else, and perhaps to play very well. And if he was willing to do that, I think the trade probably could have been done during the season, right? If the Sharks were willing to make Erik Karlsson a $7.5 million player, say, he might have been moved before February's deadline, and the return would have been better. But that would have had punitive impact on where the Sharks would be in terms of that money would be just sitting on their cap for 3 more seasons, right? 4 more seasons, rather. And so that's a lot to have to eat. I mean, I think in terms of the actual financial picture, but even just for how that impacts, a time when San Jose is going to be looking to be better. And so I would say on paper, the return doesn't look that great. Let's be honest. I mean, I think that's what it is. But there is value, and it's hard to measure that value today in not having to pay Erik Karlsson anything more than $1.5 million on your cap, for these next number of years. And really, what's the Sharks' biggest problem? They have some anchor contracts. Mike Greer's come in and he moved out Brent Burns last summer. He's been able to trade a couple players off, but there's other guys, they're just immovable objects. And that, in a lot of ways, the players earn those contracts. They earn them at a time when the Sharks were competing for the Cup every year. But the problem now is when you're trying to turn things over, it's hard to do business when you have that on your cap sheet. And so I think the San Jose end, you have to believe that they're going to use that space wisely, that there's value in having that space. And yeah, they had to make the trade this summer too, Julian. Like when you look at it, Erik Karlsson, if we did this podcast a year ago exactly today, we were doing this August 8th, 2022, and you said, what about Erik Karlsson? Could the Sharks move him? I would say no chance. 99.9% not happening, just too onerous. But because of the season Karlsson had, I think it created the conditions where this could happen. But let's face it, if he gets injured, if his performance drops off next season, and he was still in San Jose, I mean, I think it's an immovable contract. And so they did the best they could under the circumstances. At the end of the day, while Karlsson talked to a lot of teams, remember, he had a no movement clause here. So he was able to control this to a certain degree. Obviously, he had to be talking to teams that he'd want to play for. But if there was 3 at the end, he was going to choose which of the 3. I think the Sharks did reasonably well. Now, I almost want to grade. I want to say to Mike Greer's part of this report card, not complete. Like, I want to see what he does with these next couple of years. What does he do with these next couple of years? What does he do with the Mike Hoffmans and the players he brought in? Does he turn them into other draft picks? I mean, I think that there's opportunity here for him to do so. But I'm certainly not giving him a failing grade. I think on paper, again, it's an underwhelming return for the player you're trading, but you're not just trading the player, man. You're trading the contract. And they managed to move a deal, as I say, 12 months ago to the day, I would have said you were never trading that deal. And so, I think by that measurement, you should be encouraged by it. But now it's still, it's much easier to tear down than build up. And eventually we're going to be looking at San Jose and saying, what are you building up? What assets are you bringing in? I mean, ideally in this trade, probably you'd want the Sharks to be retaining 50% because that's the maximum value you could get out of the player. And if they were retaining a huge amount of money, maybe they'll get some real prime assets in the deal. And I'm not sure they did that, although we'll see where that first round pick ends up. It's top 10 protected next year, but maybe it floats to 2025, and in 2025 it's a top pick. I mean, we've seen that sort of thing happen in the past. It's a time will tell kind of deal from San Jose's end, but I do think they had to move Karlsson. He wants to play for a cup too. I mean, at the end of the day, let's talk about the player. This isn't just a contract and salary cap league. I mean, this is one of the best players who's wants the chance to win a Stanley Cup. I'm not sure Pittsburgh. If he could just choose every team in the league, I wonder how far down the list he would get to before Pittsburgh would have been there. Like, forget the return. If you just said to Erik Karlsson, in order, what teams do you think you have the best chance to win a cup with? I mean, does he get to 10 before he gets to Pittsburgh? I don't know. What do you think?
Colorado, Vegas. Trying to think of some. I mean, Dallas maybe gets a one up on Pittsburgh because of how good they've been playing.
Carolina, maybe you know, one of the teams that
Carolina,
was actually
maybe. Yes, absolutely. They were.
You're
right. They were.
Seattle was in on them.
Yes, they were. I thought about Seattle too. Are they high up on Pittsburgh? But you gotta remember too. Even though Sidney Crosby and that core is aging, it's still Sidney Crosby, still playing at a high level. Evgeny Malkin too, and Chris Letang, who has had all these health issues, he's still able to play. Like, I still think if goaltending doesn't let them down on those last few years, barring, like, let's forget last year, but those 2 previous years, if goaltending doesn't let them down, they at least win a round or 2. I still believe that with this Penguins team. It's just, I don't know what they'll look like now.
Well, in that Rangers series 2 years ago, you know, Crosby got knocked out of it. And he was playing awesome, if you remember. I mean, there's a world where healthy Sidney Crosby, one more save, and they're the team that goes to the Eastern Conference Final that year. Like, I mean, I know that we can play this game with every team, coulda, woulda, shoulda. It's a results business to a certain degree. But I think the Penguins look at a team like the Golden State Warriors, Julian. And remember, Golden State had their long sort of run where they were in it every year, winning it or very close. They had the fall off, and everyone wrote them off, and then they came back and won again. Again, I have no idea what's going to happen. I'm not betting on this. I'm not telling you what to do. But I'm just saying I think that they believe internally they can do it one more time against the odds. And you have to like your odds the more difference-making. Erik Karlsson's attitude, too, right? Like, he's a competitive guy.
Love that about him.
Like, he changes things for you. And you know he's going to be hungry, too. Like, he's got the same birth certificate. Like, he can look at it and go like, oh crap. Like he knows he doesn't have forever years. And look he's got $100 million or whatever, 100 schmel, bud. He's got all the money he needs. He's got the personal hardware. We can already, as you know, put him in the Hockey Hall of Fame. It's just a matter of 3 years after he retires, he's in. He's got one goal left. He wants that big shiny silver thing. And I don't know. I can talk myself into, like, in the middle of summer, I'm looking outside, the sun's shining. I can talk myself into Pittsburgh being a team that can get it done again. I realize you're almost expecting everything to go right that could. It's going to take something like that, but it's not impossible.
I could tell you really missed us because I feel like you almost went like 10 minutes uninterrupted on how Erik Karlsson could mean so much to this Pittsburgh Penguins team. I know you missed us.
I did. I love a good story, man. And I know you do. As much as I get excited for the young guys in this league, and we always shout those guys out, I still got like a soft spot for these players that have been around that I've gotten to know a little bit better, maybe over the years, just through time. And it's kind of cool when a career is getting to the back nine, the last 3 holes. Like, what can you get done? I mean, who would have called a 100-point season for Erik Karlsson? I mean, the guy, it's sort of what you're saying about Crosby and Malkin. Like, these guys are old, and part of you has logic in your brain, but the other part is, like, it's still Sidney Crosby. Like, he's still getting like 70, 80 points every year, and he had a 100-point season 2 years ago, right? So, I mean, it's like it could work. It could work, and I like that they're trying at least. Like, I think if you're a fan in Pittsburgh or of that team, what else can you ask for? Like, they've got your attention now, right? They've at least said, like, hey, you got to watch the games, and you got to start to dream a little bit. This is not cynical GMing. This is like we're swinging for the fences, and let's see what happens.
Let's get to You Can Bet That really quickly, and then I want your takes on some of the other free agent moves that have happened this offseason.
You Can Bet That with David Bastel. Brought to you by Sports Interaction. Get in the action and make a play. 19 plus. Please play responsibly.
Welcome to You Can Bet That. Remember to hit up sportsinteraction.com/SDPN for all of your gaming needs. Hopefully you are following the Women's World Cup. England, currently the favorite to win at plus 239. Spain at plus 344. Japan, plus 492. The 3 best odds for the remaining teams in this year's World Cup. I am sad that Jamaica is no longer in it, but I am very proud nonetheless to see the Reggae Girls go as far as they did. They lost to Colombia earlier today.
Yeah, it's been a good tournament. It's funny, I was in Europe for a good part of July, and just with the more favorable time zone, it was easier to follow it because you get up in the morning there and the games were on. I got a weird feeling Australia might do something special. I don't know, hosting the tournament. I don't know where their odds fall on the board. I like Japan too. Like, they seem to be in a team that's really kind of opened some eyes and been kicking butt. But it's been an interesting tournament. Selfishly, I want to see the Canadian women play a little bit longer. That didn't work out. Yeah. The U.S. gets stunned, and so it's kind of feels like a bit more like a free for all. But if I had to have a pick, Julian, I'd say don't sleep on Australia.
Okay, I like that. I'm going to look at Japan. I think Japan still has I'm going to say Japan will be my pick. But to your point, yeah, this tournament has been pretty unreal. Germany done before they reached the knockout stage. The United States, you mentioned them, losing to Sweden by mere millimeters off that penalty shot. And Canada, of course, a disappointing run for them. But yeah, some very intriguing results.
And Japan wins for best kit. So, I mean, even if they don't win the tournament, I love the unis. So,
look,
they can always hang their hat on that.
If there's one podcast you can count on for style takes, it's the Chris Johnston Show. Love it, absolutely love it. Love the fact you have an opinion on kits. We need your top 10 at some point.
I couldn't do 10, but I just those Japanese ones really caught my eye.
No worries. We'll get you to do some fun style stuff at some point. And also, for you watching and listening at home, don't forget to check out sportsinteraction.com/SDPN for all the best odds before game, in game, and the best props. sportsinteraction.com/SDPN. Are you going to the beach anytime soon?
No, but I am going to go swim in the pool here shortly. So,
okay. All right.
Just away with my family, extended family. Got all the kids here, nieces and nephews and the like, and so Uncle CJ will be down at the pool, roughhousing with the boys inside an hour from now.
Okay, all right. Well, let's get you closer to that time with the extended family. I just want your takes on some of the other big moves that have happened across this offseason. Not just free agent signings and trades, but some other personnel moves. Let's start with the Alex DeBrincat trade. And the signing to Detroit. You called it on this show. I don't know if you were the very first, but you were definitely among those who said that a trade, a move to Detroit was in the stars for Alex DeBrincat.
Right. And I mean, part of it just made sense, right? It's the hometown team for DeBrincat. He was 1 year out from being able to be an unrestricted free agent. So he had some degree of say in this. I think it was always in the Senators' best interest to find a place where he was willing to sign an extension, which he was. He signed a pretty favorable extension, right? A little less than $8 million on the AAV on that deal. And so I think it's I don't know if we'll go as far to say it's team friendly, but it certainly isn't swinging for the mood. To me, it's a sign of how badly he wanted to play there. And ultimately, Ottawa had to deal with a small group of teams where he was willing to consider that kind of contract and that kind of situation. And so in a lot of ways, it reflects what we saw with Pierre-Luc Dubois going from Winnipeg to LA earlier in the offseason, where the player had a fair bit of control, even if the team still had one more year of official control by the CBA standard of that definition. And so, yeah, DeBrincat, I think for Ottawa, if you look at the decision in its totality, they didn't get out of him what they hoped to by giving up the 7th overall pick back in the 2022 draft. But they get out of it what they could, and they move forward. And, we still see the Senators get active this offseason. They signed Vladimir Tarasenko, pretty deep into free agency, I think, to try to replace some of the goal scoring you're losing with someone like DeBrincat and pretty low risk deal for Tarasenko, just a 1-year contract. And so I think all things considered, probably the biggest question we have in Ottawa right now, Julian, has nothing to do with the DeBrincat trade, even the Tarasenko signing. To me, it's what's it going to look like in their crease? I think if they get some saves, they're a team that has a chance to climb up and maybe steal one of those wildcard spots and make the playoffs. I think that they're at that point where certainly internally at the organization with a new ownership group coming into place here in the fall. I mean, that's going to be a step that they're looking to take. But their biggest bet for me of the entire offseason in Ottawa was signing Joonas Korpisalo to the contract they did on July 1st. And is that going to be enough with Forsberg coming back and hopefully being healthy, and Korpisalo, is that tandem good enough to get them into the mix in the Atlantic Division, or at least in the Eastern Conference when it comes to a wild card spot? Only time will tell. But, DeBrincat, I think under some duress, probably the best kind of trade you can make for Pierre Dorion, because, again, we're in a bit of a players' league right now. I mean, there's a few other situations out there that might end up mirroring this. I think Dubas is the closest one that's happened already this summer. But, if the player isn't signing long-term with you and he's only got 1 year of control left, I mean, you're just not going to get huge returns back. And that's kind of how I view the DeBrincat situation. And, as for Detroit, what's interesting there, of course, is they're a team like Ottawa in a lot of ways. They're looking to climb up and try to be competing for those same playoff spots. And they're just, it's such a tight conference, the East, really. When you look at Buffalo being in that spot, with Ottawa, Montreal maybe isn't quite as far along in their rebuild or retool, whatever we'll call it. But, I mean, at some point, the ship's going to turn over, right? And I don't know that it's going to be this coming season, but I think in the next 2 years, we're going to see a bit of a shift in the balance of power when it comes to some of these teams in that Atlantic Division specifically.
Just want to ask a quick thing with Ottawa. This is just me here. Maybe you could tell me if I'm wrong. Shouldn't the biggest question surrounding the Ottawa Senators, especially with that new ownership group coming in, is what is Pierre Dorion's future going to be with this organization? That's just my thought.
Yeah, I mean, that's a question, and that's going to be a conversation and a topic. Like that won't go away. I just think with the fact that ownership change hasn't officially happened. I know Michael Andlauer has been around the team. He was at their development camp recently, and he's starting to get his hands on the operation, but he's not officially in control yet. And so I would think there's probably 1 more year of runway, or at least there's going to be time here, I think, where further assessment has to happen before necessarily there's a change there. But yeah, that's a fair question. But Pierre Dorion's been running the ship this summer. I mean, the team that's due to report to training camp in 5 weeks' time, that's Pierre Dorion's team. I don't think there's any question about it. I mean, he's been responsible for the decisions of that organization at the hockey ops level for a long time, and that includes July when they make the DeBrincat trade, when they make the signings they did in free agency. And so this is still his team, and until otherwise informed, and nobody's been informed otherwise just yet.
Let me talk about another Eastern Conference team, the Boston Bruins. Patrice Bergeron announcing his retirement. He will no longer be the 1C for the Boston Bruins. And David Krejci, I think a lot of people are expecting him to announce his retirement. His future is still very much up in the air. What do you make of the Boston Bruins and their center situation?
I mean, you're just not replacing that guy, right? I mean, that's the hard part, and they would know that internally, right? I think that they've been preparing for the day. They've understood that even last year there was a chance when it came to the summer that Bergeron would walk away. I should say first and foremost, one of the most gentlemanly players I ever had the pleasure of dealing with during my time in my career. Everything you've heard about him from afar has been reflected in my personal experiences with Patrice Bergeron. Just a truly unique guy. I think his Selke Awards everything speaks for what he is. But now he's walked away after a really good season. And he's won another Selke Award. So, I mean, full credit to him to have that sense of timing and to just, whether it's, he's had another baby this summer, his wife did, and maybe feeling on the family front it was time, or just something with his body. Like, who knows exactly what led him to that point. But it couldn't have been an easy decision, especially with the regular season the Bruins had last year, setting all the records, losing in the first round, with Bergeron not being able to play all those games, suffering a back injury late in the year. I mean, it set up for him to return in a lot of ways. If you're the movie script writer, you're saying he comes back for 1 more year and the Bruins go at it, and that's not what's going to happen. And so I don't think it's a precipitous fall necessarily coming to Boston, but I don't know how they fill his minutes, and certainly with Krejci's decision looming still, if you lose your top 2 centers, I don't care what team you are, I don't care what your prospect list looks like. I mean, it takes a long time to get players of that caliber. And so, it puts Boston in a little bit of a hole. But, I mean, first and foremost, you tip your cap to a player who had a huge impact on the league on kind of I look at that team. I mean, there's probably been a few teams in the generation that I've covered the NHL, but that team had a feel, right? Like that team truly, every team talks about culture. The Bruins had a culture, right? And
Yes.
someone like Patrice Bergeron, obviously, was Zdeno Chara, I think Brad Marchand. You see Charlie McAvoy, he's probably the next wave of that. David Pasternak. I mean, all these players that spent a long time as Bruins have really sort of nurtured that. And I think Bergeron is a huge part of that. And you know, selfishly, I'm just sad to see him walk away, to be honest, just because I think he's such a great, you know, sort of ambassador for the sport, and I think he still had some juice left. But you know, it's also nice in a way to see someone leave when they feel like it's time. You know, because sometimes players hang on too long. Maybe they subject themselves to further injury. Maybe not as great a quality of life in retirement. You know, in this case, Bergeron, you know, clearly he just felt that the time was right. And I don't know if you saw his press conference, Julian, but it's him in a golf shirt alone at a podium. Like, it was just so understated in a lot of ways. And that's the guy. That's really the guy. You want to know a weird Patrice Bergeron story?
I would love to hear a weird Patrice Bergeron story. Absolutely.
Very early in my career, one of actually my first cool assignments out of nowhere when I was young is I got a chance to go cover the 2006 Men's World Hockey Championship. And that tournament was played in Latvia. 06, of course, was an Olympic year. So the Turin Games had happened in February. And so when it came time to send a team to the Worlds in May or April, they went with a young team. They weren't asking at that time, they weren't asking the Ed Jovanovskis or the Ryan Smiths, or, the guys that represented Canada. And so it ended up being a really good young team. You had Crosby there. You had Bergeron, a whole bunch of guys. And, you know, so I was over there. I covered that tournament. I was a really green reporter in a lot of ways. And, you know, I covered the event. And it was like 5 years later, like 5 years pass. And I do one of those NHL car wash things where the players come and you get very brief one-on-one, say a 10-minute one-on-one with the players. And Patrice Bergeron walks in my room and he just looks at me and he goes, "Latvia!" I couldn't believe he remembered that I had been in Latvia covering the World Championship. And it had happened like in the years since. Every time I'd see him, he'd say like Latvia or Riga.
That's pretty funny.
And I just thought it was just like, I don't even know why it stuck in his memory. I mean, it's like, you must have this experience. And I don't say this, I'm actually not saying anything bad about players. I think a lot of times when players do their media responsibilities, they don't see a face. Like they do it. It's part of their day. Some of them like it. Some of them like it so much. Like, it's not always, you know, it's a little bit transactional, right? But I just thought it was funny. Like, how the heck, of all the reporters he talks to, did he remember that I was in Latvia? And like literally 5 years later, he just walks in a room and just yells Latvia at me. And he did it again recently. I wish I could remember when, but a year or two ago, he did it again. So I guess Patrice and I will always have Latvia, even though I actually have no specific recollection of interviewing him there. I obviously must have. I mean, how else would he remember me? But I don't even have a story from that tournament when it comes to him or I. It's not like we weren't hanging out having coffee, right? I was just doing my job and he was doing his job. But it's funny. I have a feeling I'm going to see him in like 10 years' time at some, you know, in a press box somewhere. He's going to work for a team at some point or be doing something, and he's going to see me in the press box. He's going to say Latvia. I'd put money on it.
Let me go from Patrice Bergeron up in Boston to Connor McDavid. His longtime agent, Jeff Jackson, promoted to the Edmonton Oilers front office. Very intrigued about him and his new position with the Edmonton Oilers. What do you think about Connor McDavid's agent, Jeff Jackson? Oh, and can you remind everyone who Connor McDavid's new agent is when you explain your pros about Connor McDavid and the new development?
Yeah, a lot of layers to this onion, you call it. And so Connor McDavid now slides over to Judd Moldaver, who's also from Wasserman Hockey, which is where Jeff Jackson works. So it's essentially Connor McDavid staying in the same agency, but now he's represented by the same agent as one Austin Matthews. And so Judd Moldaver, already pretty big agent in the industry, let's face it, he has Roman Josi, Zach Werenski, a whole bunch of other clients. But now he's also got McDavid and Matthews, who between them have a number of the most recent Hart Trophy, Ted Lindsay Awards, Rocket Richard trophies between them. I mean, they both have pretty full cabinets. So that's interesting. And I think from the Oilers standpoint, it's pretty clear what they want to happen here. I mean, this is the Oilers feel that they're right on the cusp of competing for a Stanley Cup. I think the results show that. They were in the Western Conference Final 2 years ago, made it to the second round this last spring. They have a team that they're trying to get over the hump. And as they're doing that, they face some big decisions. I mean, the first that isn't maybe discussed that much is Ken Holland, their general manager, has 1 year left on his contract. And he's at an age where I don't think it's a foregone conclusion necessarily that he will return. I know he's been he hasn't really been very committal when asked about his own future. I'm not sure he yet knows exactly what he wants. And so, my read on this situation is, one, they wanted to bring someone into the organization to oversee the succession plan at the GM level. And, really, if you're Ken Holland, you want him focusing on being the GM, trying to build the team that can get over the hump and win that Stanley Cup and not have to be worrying about that question for the organization standpoint. And then the second one, I think that is impossible to ignore here. Leon Draisaitl has 2 years left on his deal. So by this time next summer, the Oilers will be seeking to sign him to a long-term extension and commit his future. And then Connor McDavid has only 3 years left on his deal. So 2 years from now, he will be eligible to sign his own extension. And so I think it's clear that with Jeff Jackson's experience level, you may not recall this, Julian, but he worked for the Maple Leafs in the early days of the cap era, was a former player himself, and then has obviously had a pretty unique window into what's going on in Edmonton by representing Connor McDavid these last number of years, has spent a lot of time around the team, understands how they got to where they're at, and now gets to come inside the doors, affect change from the top seat, a seat that reports directly to ownership and Daryl Cates. And then, you're doing it at this time when you're going to have to, at some point, I think, usher in a new GM. You're going to have to try to sign Draisaitl, and then ultimately the biggest fish, the most important piece of whatever is going to be for the Oilers is getting Connor McDavid's signature on a contract. And, it's way too soon with 3 years left on his deal to predict how that's going to unfold. But I think if you're at the management level or the ownership level, rather, in Edmonton, you feel more comfortable going into this crucial period with someone who has the relationship in the past with McDavid that Jeff Jackson does. And so I think it's a confluence of events that brought him to that role. But the biggest task, the immediate task, of course, is trying to help the organization get over the hump. But I think it's figuring out the front office and then figuring out how to keep the core members of the team in place there. And, we might, I'm sure over the course of these next 2 years, wonder what if Draisaitl doesn't want to sign there? What if you get to a point McDavid doesn't? We're not at that point today, but I think that's kind of setting the tone for where things have to go now for the Oilers under Jeff Jackson's watch.
Speaking of Austin Matthews, as you mentioned just very briefly earlier in your Connor McDavid answer, any news on him, William Nylander? This is your opportunity for Leafs Corner for the next little while.
Well, I'll say this. The good news is if you've been on vacation and not paying attention to hockey news or what's going on, you haven't missed anything. Because as we sit here on August 8th, I don't have any reason to believe anything's going on the Matthews front, on the Nylander front. And, I don't know when those talks will maybe pick up more steam, when you'll get to a point where we're talking with them, perhaps signing an extension. There's a lot to unpack here. I think that they're in some ways separate issues. Let's start with Nylander just because. If you remember when the Leafs signed William Nylander, Austin Matthews, and Mitch Marner to their second NHL contracts, it was Nylander who signed first. So he had to be the first one to put his salary on the board, right? And he ended up with just under $7 million. Then Austin Matthews comes in, right? And he gets $11.6 million. And then Mitch Marner comes in and he gets 10.8, 10.9, something like that. And I think that Nylander probably looks back in history and says the gap in his eyes or his agent's eyes shouldn't have been that wide. And so I don't know that he's in a rush to be the next guy to commit to his next contract first. And so I think that he's quite comfortable waiting it out. It's not to say he won't sign. That's really not what I want the takeaway to be here. But I don't think that he feels any rush to make a decision on that next deal. And, I think Matthew's situation is totally separate of it. I think, as we've talked about, there's no reason, nothing has changed on this front. There's no reason to believe he's not going to sign in Toronto. I think he still wants to be there. Like that's not to explain why this hasn't happened yet. I don't think we should read into it that. Really, I think his focus is on what's the best way to get this team to have a chance to win. I mean, the guy wants to win at this stage of his career. And so, I think that there's going to be certainly a lot more conversation between now and the start of training camp. There'll be a question as training camp gets sooner, and we are still, 5-6 weeks away. Is it best to just get it done before training camp? Have no circumstance where the Leafs report on the first day of training camp, and everybody who's there doing a job like yours and ours will be talking about why isn't Matthews signed? What's this contract going to look like? Are the Leafs screwed? You might argue, and I'm not saying that Austin Matthews would argue this or even Leafs management, but you might argue that's not the ideal way to start the season if you're trying to win a Stanley Cup and take a step forward as an organization. But just at this point in the summer, I don't think it's been a priority. I mean, really, I don't know how much you've been dialed in on your IG, man. But this has just been a wedding season for these guys. Like I think
everyone's getting
Mitch
married.
Marner
No, sorry, you go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
I was going to say, but Mitch Marner got married here recently, and both Austin Matthews and William Nylander traveled back to the Niagara area outside of Toronto for that wedding. There's been other people in their lives that have been getting married. I think these guys are enjoying the summer. Honestly, I don't get any sense that anything is cooking on the contract front. But I will say this is a big but. Let's look at what happened last year in Colorado, where Nathan McKinnon had a nice summer. His summer was even better than these Leafs players' summer because he just won a cup. And so he got to have a good summer last year. And then on the eve of training camp, there and abouts in September, he signed his extension in the same spot these guys are at, 1 year out from potential UFA. He signed a long-term deal with the Avs. I still think that there's a lot of time for that business to get done, but I can tell you this safely. If you just spent from July 10th till now not caring about this story, you really didn't miss a thing. I think there's probably been some text messages exchanged, maybe a few conversations, but nothing tangible in terms of pushing towards an extension at this point in time for either player.
Do we have time for like one really quick or two really quick Ask CJ questions before we let you go?
Sure, let's go quick because that pool is yelling my name.
From Wham876543, best thing you guys did this summer or are planning to?
Well, for me, it's easy. I went on a European vacation. It was sick. I actually truly spent 2 weeks where I didn't think about hockey almost at all. Was quite removed from it. Probably the highlight, it's tough for me to say. I went to a couple different places, but I actually went to the Italian Dolomites, a mountain region up in the northeast part of Italy near the border with Austria, and just went on hikes, ran up some mountains, looked at some mountains. That was probably the coolest thing. I'd never been exactly to that part of the world. I drove there too, Julian, like a 5-hour drive through the mountains. It was pretty spectacular. So that was probably the highlight of my trip, and safe to say I've still got some fun planned in August here, but that'll probably be the highlight of my summer when all's said and done. What about you?
Okay, just give me the coolest thing I got to do. Just honestly, just not really care that much about what's going on. Just go home, be with my family, be with my grandmother, who turned 82 this year, and be at church with her and have everyone wish her happy birthday. She really enjoyed herself. That's probably the best thing I did all summer, to be honest. I just need 2 teams from you for this one from Matt. What is your early Super Bowl prediction?
Well, the Cowboys are winning the Super Bowl. And they're going to beat Tennessee.
Oh, my Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ. God. I knew this was going to happen, but you know what? Forget it.
Or should I just have picked Buffalo? Should I have appeased the fans and been like Dallas over Buffalo? We're going back in time.
Oh, God. You know what would actually be terrible? You know what would actually cause a lot of people to go into hysteria? If we got a Cowboys-Jets Super Bowl this year. Do you realize how that would go? That would, we would be pitted against each other. Those are our teams. We would be pitted against each other. It would be pure madness.
Are the Jets even capable of winning more than 6 games in a season?
That's a great question. I have no expectations for this team this year. I'll be quite honest. Everyone's saying they're going to win the division or they're going to be a wild card team. They're going to make the playoffs. I totally expect them to fall off a cliff and be 5-11 or 5-12 or whatever. I totally expect that.
Well, I can't remember the last time I was even concerned about the Jets. They're just always a perennial forgotten team at this point.
I was in high school when they were decent. I
yes.
don't know. They have Aaron Rodgers now. It doesn't matter. Who cares? You guys don't come to us
I
for
thought you were
NFL
going to
stuff.
ask for
you come for NHL stuff.
I thought you were going to ask for the early Stanley Cup picks. And I was like, I haven't even thought 1 second about that. So I'm glad you didn't ask that. I mean, I'll think about it before our next show, but
yeah,
I need to see where
whenever
Patrick Kane signs first, and then I'll tell you.
That's true. Thank you to everyone who tuned in for today's episode of the CJ Show. This was always fun to do the summer drop-ins. I don't know when the next summer drop-in will be. You just have to, keep your ears to the streets, subscribe to the SDPN YouTube page, look out for our Twitters, Reporter Chris's handle, JK McKenzie's mine, and then you'll figure out when the next episode is coming out, man. Gotta pay attention.
Well, this is a surprise. I didn't even tease this, did you?
I don't think I asked on Discord for questions, but I didn't tease it anywhere else. This is very much a surprise.
Right. So hopefully you've just, whatever your favorite podcatcher, and this just drops like a gift from the sky, out of the August sky, something for you to listen to when you're out doing your exercise or your errands or whatever you do. But thanks for listening, guys. I mean, I'm excited to be back. We're gonna do another one at some point, but we'll give you a couple weeks to chill, Julian. I know you got some plans here this month, so. Oh,
and I know that pool is calling your name. Thank you so much to everyone for paying attention and subscribing to the show and tuning in. And be on the lookout for whenever we will have our next episode this summer. For CJ, I'm Julian. So long, and peace.
The Chris Johnston Show.
Powered by Sports Interaction. Want to bet?
Inside the Game, twice a week. Follow Chris on Twitter @ReporterChris. And follow Julian McKenzie @JK McKenzie.
The Chris Johnston Show.